Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. It's been too long. I had me and Aaron on Friday. I've got me and you today. As I said on Friday, nature is being restored.
I'm so glad that the natural order of things has been restored, because I was just having to play act Novara Live. I made my cat pretend to be you. His political analysis was, it left a lot to be desired, quite frankly. So I'm glad I've got the real thing.
Well, I am glad that I am more articulate and insightful than Musa, your cat. Coming up tonight, we're talking a bit more about the budget. We are talking about the latest when it comes to the potential Ukraine-Russia peace deal. Zack Polanski on the BBC on Sunday. A very viral moment where lots of people are attacking him, lots of people supporting him. I'll speak to an economist, and we will be discussing what was a really strange Friday. This all broke after we went. So the news is slightly old, but it's remarkable enough to be worth revisiting, which is Donald Trump just heaping praise on Zohran Mamdani in the White House. And then this was even weirder, which was Benjamin Netanyahu sharing an article by Jacobin magazine. So two alliances that the Democratic Socialists of America presumably thought would never be possible. I mean, also they'd be offended by me saying they formed some kind of alliance with Netanyahu, but him sharing an article by them was notable nonetheless. Before we get started, I want to remind you all of the next IRL event tomorrow. Ash Sarkar and Moya Lovey-McLean are coming to the Contact Theatre in Manchester. They'll be speaking to Lanre Bakare, author of We Were There, How Black Culture, Resistance and Community Shaped Modern Britain. Ash, is this the first time in your life you'll ever have left London?
Yeah, and I'm really worried about it. I'm scared of getting a nosebleed. I've decided it's time for me to bury the hatchet. As many will know, I've had a long-standing beef with the entire city of Manchester for various reasons, too complicated to go into, but a lot of it was down to the fact that growing up, I supported Tottenham Hotspur through some really quite doldrum years, and my sister supported Manchester United when they won the treble. So, apropos, entire city of Manchester got caught up in the sibling beef, but decided to squash the beef, and myself and Moya and Lanre Bakare will be at Contact Theatre tomorrow. You can get still, I think there's a few tickets left if you go to the Contact Theatre site. And we're going to be discussing a question which I think is so relevant to the themes of Lanre's book, but it's also something which is being debated in all sorts of ways, particularly by right-wing media, which is, does British culture need saving? And if so, from what? Because I actually think there are so many ways to address this question. Obviously, the right want to say, oh, everything that's been lost about British culture, that's because of, too much immigration, too many ethnic minorities. And as I was reading Lanre's book, which is this fabulous history of Black Britain outside of London. So community self-defense organizations in Bradford, blues parties in Birmingham, just so much history of Black culture in this country. You realize that a lot of not just Black culture in this country, but working class culture in this country of all ethnicities, a lot of that history was failed to be preserved because of certain changes in the 1980s and 1990s. So I don't know if you knew this before, Michael, and I'll leave the viewers with this because hopefully it will tempt them to buy tickets. Did you know that Wigan Casino, which was the epicenter of the Northern Soul scene here in the UK, Wigan Casino was demolished in the 80s to make space for a car park? And there are so many other iconic British dance clubs which have been lost to shopping centres and luxury flats and car parks. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, no, I agree. That sounds fascinating. I thought it was going to, you say, what's destroyed British culture? I was going to go smartphones again, but there are other answers. And that sounds like a very interesting one. Do look up tickets for that. They'll presumably be in the description if you are in or near Manchester. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. As ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. The budget is just 2 days away. Are you excited? I am. And British, or Britain's political class also is. Maybe I'm part of it. Who knows? We have been getting some more interesting clues as to what it will contain. The biggest announcement is about scrapping the 2-child benefit cap, which poverty charities and campaigners have long been calling for. The Independent reported that move as a ploy to appease rebellious backbenchers. I'm sure Rachel Reese is also interested in the fact that it's going to lift millions of children out of poverty. To appease the bond markets, though, or voters who are sometimes sceptical about benefits. In fact, voters in general support the 2-child cap. That obviously doesn't mean we should keep it. We should get rid of it. But yes, to appease those who are sceptical, it will come alongside another policy. That's a crackdown on benefit fraud, or so-called benefit fraud, which will supposedly save the government £1.2 billion. These are the things that's always very easy to announce and then somewhat more difficult to follow through on. And also potentially harmful to try and follow through on if it ends up putting sort of a laser-focused scrutiny on people who are claiming benefits. On tax, the government has also suggested they will introduce a mansion tax on homes worth over £2 million. Very good policy. And they're also going to revalue homes in the upper bands for council tax, which will mean some households in London and the South East will pay more. Property values haven't been assessed since 1990 when it comes to council tax. So this sounds eminently sensible to me. Someone who is not impressed is Kirsty Alsop. She says, almost every day I get a call from a journalist to discuss a possible mansion tax. How did we reach this point when we already have the highest and most progressive taxes in Europe? And still our government is planning on an envy tax, because basically that is what it is. Now, in terms of the most progressive taxes in Europe, she's talking about income tax. There's a couple of interesting reports in the FT and The Economist saying that actually when it comes to income tax, we do have a very progressive system in that sort of lower income people or middle income people actually pay only 29% tax. Higher income people pay, I think it was 40 or 46% tax, something like that, 45 maybe. This wasn't just the tax band, it's sort of how much you actually pay from your income. So maybe a point there. We don't pay the highest taxes in Europe by any measure whatsoever. We pay low taxes compared to the rest of Europe. And then the idea that a mansion tax is the politics of envy. People who bought their house in the 1970s for £15,000 and it's now worth £2 million. Yes, I am envious of them. Right? I'm not ashamed of that. I think in many circumstances, the politics of envy is very much justified. If someone is now a multimillionaire through good luck, then yes, I am envious of them. And yes, we should tax them more. So I will happily subscribe to the politics of envy when it comes to people sitting in houses which have sort of increased by 10 or 15 times through no hard work of that person's doing. So yes, I'm envious and we should tax them. Someone else who is unhappy with Britain's tax policy alongside Kirsty Alsop is Lakshmi Mittal. The billionaire steel magnate has quit the UK for Switzerland and Dubai. Mittal is worth over £15 billion and is the 7th richest man in Britain. His London property portfolio is worth £300 million. Luckily, he can't move those. So, I mean, either he'll keep them or he'll sell them and someone else can buy them. Who really cares? Mittal was a non-dom, so wasn't paying any tax on his non-UK income anyway. He apparently left because he didn't want to have to pay inheritance tax on assets held abroad when he died. So this is a very rich gentleman. I mean, an entrepreneur of sorts, like he has a steel business, but the steel works weren't in this country. What he was doing in this country was buying up assets and, you know, potentially some high-value services. So it might have sort of created some jobs, but I don't think they'd have been particularly useful or productive jobs. I would prefer those people to be working in different sectors with sort of more multipliers. Business Secretary Peter Kyle, though, was asked about Lakshmi Mittal leaving on Sky.
Are you worried, honestly, about some of the super rich leaving the UK? Or if they're not prepared to pay the amount of taxes that you should think they should, do you not really care?
I am worried whenever somebody feels that they have to leave the UK in order to succeed. You know, we've gone through a period where loads of doctors, thousands of doctors, have left the country. But just specifically, on the kind of billionaire thing, right? No, I understand. So whenever anyone needs to leave the UK to succeed, I think it's a worry. What I don't want to do is be, as a country, just focus just on the billionaires, because there are other people that have needed to leave. There are people starting businesses that have gone to America, actually in their droves, because they haven't had the funding that they need in this country to succeed. And that is something that we are fundamentally stopping the need for by recapitalising the market markets here and putting a lot of work in for those spin-outs and those startups, those scale-up companies.
Do you acknowledge that some of it is because of the tax decisions of this Labour government?
I do.
You do?
Yes,
is that
I do. Now, I'm not going to duck the fact that we have put up taxes and we've closed some of the loopholes for non-doms. On the other hand, we've set up this a global talent task force. We have set up a global talent visa. We are making it easier for people to come here who have high talents. Now, some people aren't going to leave because they were here because of the way that the old non-dom system worked. There are other people who are coming to this country because of the excitement that's in our economy at the moment, the fact we're investing in AI, that people like Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, the biggest company in the world, says we're going through a Goldilocks moment as a country when it comes to AI. So lots of people are coming here because of the new excitement in our country. But I accept, because of some of the decisions we've made, like closing those non-dom tax loopholes, some people will feel the need to leave.
No, I have to say, I didn't actually mind that answer from Peter Carr, because I think he's right. We do want entrepreneurs to come to Britain. We want Britain to be a good place to start a business. But we don't care if people who've made their money elsewhere want to come here and buy a house and use fancy services and maybe put a little bit of money into the high-end restaurant sector in Mayfair, which really doesn't mean much to many other people. On the point of whether sort of taxing the rich will make them leave the country, there was a very interesting poll in YouGov today, which I think shows where the country is at on this point. So they've asked two questions. So they say, when it comes to super rich individuals, taking into account that their behaviour may change as a result, do you think the government would be more likely to generate more tax revenue if they raised tax rates for the super rich or if they lowered tax rates for the super rich? And a vast majority of people say it would raise more revenue. Now, asking the general public what would be the economic outcome of an economic policy, you might say that's a bit meaningless because clearly, most people don't know. I mean, no one really knows. Probably it will make more money, yes, but they're talking about the Laffer curve. It's all sort of complex, and one probably should ask economists or at least people with some expertise. The next bit, though, is the interesting one. So they say, if the effect of raising taxes on super rich individuals was that the government made less in tax revenue because super rich individuals chose to leave the UK to avoid having to pay the tax rises, would you support or oppose raising such taxes? And then still, the majority support it. Now, you might say that's a long question. Maybe they'd lost interest by the time they read the whole of it. But on the face of it, this is people saying that they would prefer to raise taxes on the super rich, even if it lost the Treasury money, because people left the country. Ash, as I say, when it comes to polls with slightly complicated, long questions, maybe you shouldn't rest too much on them. But it is interesting that, at least on the face of it, people really want to tax the super rich, even if it loses the government money, which is interesting, right? Either people really care about inequality or they just are really fucking angry about these people. So you can look at it in a technocratic way or a sort of emotional way. But what's your take?
I'm always disinclined to look at people's political viewpoints and policy preferences just through the lens of what you might term as sort of economistic self-interest, because that's a technocratic argument. It's like, okay, well, if line go up or if, income improve, then people like those things. The fact is that all of us are able to think about things that we value in our own lives, in our communities, in society at large, that you can't necessarily put a monetary value on. So some people would say, well, actually, I know I could earn more money if I lived in this place, but this other place has got really good schools for my kid, or it's got, lovely green spaces or whatever. We're making those decisions in that way all the time because we value things which aren't just money. And so when it comes to how you interpret polling like this, I think you're right to say, okay, be a little bit wary when the polling question and prompts are very, very wordy. But it reminds me of something, which is a piece of polling which came out in 2016, immediately following the Brexit vote. And this was some surveys done by Lord Ashcroft Polls. And in looking at people who voted Brexit, there were significant proportions of them who would be happy with taking a hit to their personal income if it meant reducing immigration. So some people wanted to, reduce immigration to zero, and they'd be willing to take a hit to their personal incomes by quite a bit. For other people, it was a bit more calibrated. And I thought that this was a really important piece of research, because it shows you that there are people who are looking at immigration not just in terms of, does this make me richer or make me poorer? But here are all these other things which I think are really important. And many of those things aren't things that I think of as being particularly important. You know, someone would be willing to take a big hit to their personal income because they want a racially homogenous society. Just because they think that doesn't mean it's good. But it shows that everyone has things that they value outside of monetary value. And that's the case on the right. And it's also the case for what you might think of as traditional left-wing policies. So something like a wealth tax or something that is targeting billionaire wealth specifically. Sure, there are all sorts of arguments you might want to make about reducing inequality or the benefits to the treasury, but people have an idea of fairness being a social good and a moral good, which isn't just about how good is it for His Majesty's treasury. So people will look at, you know, billionaires who don't really put into society and buy loads of mansions, or, you know, are obnoxious in their consumerism and go, I don't like that. I find something about that morally noxious. You know, look, people have an idea of what they want in terms of policies, and they also have an idea of who it is they want to punish and why. You know, who it is that lacks social or moral legitimacy in society. And policy preferences can reflect those things as well as simple, you know, I think this is good for the treasury, I think this is good for my personal income.
Let's go to, I suppose, the woman who's in charge of what happens on Wednesday, Rachel Reeves. She had a profile in the Times on Saturday where this was her complaint. So Rachel Reeves is sick of the mansplaining. I mean, yes, the first female chancellor is annoyed about unsolicited advice from men. Ash, do you sympathise?
Yeah, this is the thing that Sylvia Pankhurst and, you know, feminists of every wave from Mary Wollstonecraft onwards fought for. You know, it wasn't the right to divorce. It wasn't the right to open a bank account. It wasn't the right to collectively bargain as part of a trade union. It wasn't a right to abortion. You know, it wasn't the right for marital rape to be recognised as criminal offence. No, it was so that the Chancellor of the Exchequer shouldn't feel unfairly criticised for her policy decisions. So I read this profile on Friday, and I was just flicking through the news, as is my wont, and I saw that had been the pull quote that the Times was leading on. You know, I'm sick of all the mansplaining. And I thought, okay, well, you know, the Times, it's a right-wing newspaper. Maybe they selected a quote in a way which was misleading. And maybe she was talking explicitly about people who make comments about her which are disparaging on the basis of gender. And to be fair, I think that some people do make those kinds of comments. I think the whole Rachel from accounts thing is sort of a bit gendered and condescending. But then when I looked through to the actual article copy, what it said was she was sick of people who were, you know, armchair critics and people who were trying to tell her how to do the job of chancellor. And I just thought, that's not mansplaining. That's called being in politics. I mean, I don't understand. I cannot wrap my head around the entitlement that would generate that thought of, I deserve to have one of the most powerful jobs in government, and I also reserve the right for no one to have any criticisms of how I do it. Now, when it comes to reasons why you might criticize Rachel Reeves, I mean, look, famous saying, opinions are like arseholes. Absolutely everyone has one. But I think that there are some criticisms which have more legitimacy than others. And for me, my main criticism of Rachel Reeves, and I'm talking about her as a politician rather than a criticism of Rachel Reeves in terms of the policy outcomes, which, you know, I think just because you're doing austerity with a red rosette on doesn't make it morally better. But putting that aside for a second, I think that her biggest shortcoming as a politician is that, like many other Labour frontbenchers, she thinks in tactics and not strategy. So think of all the different ways in which she's boxed herself in as a tactic to draw a dividing line between herself and, you know, the Tory government of Liz Truss, she said, okay, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they're basically going to get the whip hand over any budget that I do. Their forecasting is going to be mega, mega important as to whether or not I think, I can borrow or I can spend, or do taxes need to go up, or do there need to be cuts in spending? All of those things are going to be broadly shaped by the OBR. The second thing is in terms of fiscal rules. So fiscal rules, you might have better and worse reasons for having individual rules, but part of what this is about is having a tactic to reassure the bond markets to not drive up your cost of borrowing. But the problem is, and this is one of the reasons why borrowing so expensive for the Treasury, is because it's a confidence game. And so if you choose a bunch of fiscal rules, which the markets go, I don't think there's a big chance of you delivering the things that you say you're going to deliver, like on growth with these fiscal rules, well, that is just going to drive up the cost of borrowing even more. But if you got rid of your fiscal rules, which you've made the center point of your chancellorship, well, that's even worse, right? So the bond markets freak out even more. Another tactic of saying, okay, income tax and corporation tax and VAT, none of these are going to go up, and this is going to be our pledge. It then means that if you start doing what the government had been doing a couple of weeks ago, which is flirt with the idea of an income tax, that does have a risk of completely demolishing trust. Now, I think that there are arguments that you could make to say, oh, they're trying to manage expectations, but you could see how that's a strategic misstep. Like, the tactic might serve the purpose of trying to get you over the line for a general election, but in terms of your strategy, right? How am I going to build consent for decisions which might not always be popular? It's a pretty bad one. So I have no doubt that Rachel Reeves might accuse me of mansplaining when I talk about stuff like this, but I'm afraid that's just a cross I have to bear. And I'll be enjoying that 17% pay bump from Novara Media that comes from being a documented mansplainer.
There is a lot of entitlement there to say, look, let me get on with running an economy of 7 million people, and please don't comment on what I'm doing. I'm just doing my job. You do your job. Like, if there were ever a job that really affects everyone and everyone has a right to comment on, it's this, right? Like, I can see if you're a doctor and someone is not a doctor is sort of saying, well, I think actually you should do this XYZ in surgery. I can see why you could say, like, just I don't need your advice. I'm doing my job. But if you're Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most important job in the country, then we're going to have opinions, I'm afraid. Also, she is the least popular Chancellor ever. And you say, oh, she's the first female Chancellor ever, and she's the least popular Chancellor ever. Maybe there's a connection there. Well, guess who's the least popular Prime Minister ever? Is Keir Starmer, white guy Keir Starmer. So I'm not really sure identity issues explain the unpopularity of this government. Russia's war on Ukraine has been going on for nearly 4 years, and it's never come very close to ending. And of course, there have been plenty of false starts. But now, suddenly, there's not one, but two peace plans on the table with indications from the United States and the EU, and even Ukraine, that an agreement may be close. This morning, US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. Is it really possible that big progress is being made in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine? Don't believe it until you see it, but something good just may be happening. God bless America. That's a long way from Donald Trump's messaging late last week, when the US president when the US presented Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with a take-it-or-leave-it 28-point peace plan.
He'll have to like it, and if he doesn't like it, then, they should just keep fighting, I guess,
The suggestion that you made, though, was that if he doesn't accept it, that the U.S. would pull back its support for Ukraine.
Well, at some point he's going to have to accept something. He hasn't accepted. You remember right in the Oval Office not so long ago, I said, you don't have the cards.
So what was this plan? Well, it was reportedly drafted by advisors from the Kremlin and the White House. And Zelensky described it as giving a choice, or giving Ukraine a choice between losing dignity or American support. So a tough choice for him and the country. The biggest threat to Ukrainian dignity was perhaps what the deal said about Ukrainian territory. So if agreed, the plan would have Ukraine hand over the whole of the eastern Donbass, including those parts of Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk, provinces that Russia hasn't so far been able to take. That's not actually quite true, because it wasn't handing over parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, but parts of Luhansk and Donetsk. The areas in pink are those that Russia currently controls. The plan also required Ukraine to declare Russian an official language, to limit the size of the Ukrainian army to 600,000, which in fact, it's slightly less than what it is now. So at the moment it's 850,000, but they're fighting a war. It's still double what it was at the start of the war. So I didn't actually see this as too much of an imposition. Ukraine is also required to give up any long-range missiles that it already has that could reach inside Russian territory. The plan would also block Ukraine from joining NATO, but would allow for EU membership. In response to the Trump plan, European leaders warned against changing borders by force and said Ukraine's right to apply for EU membership should be formalized. EU membership was already in the 28-point deal, so I'm not sure what the beef was there. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen laid out the European position here.
First, borders cannot be changed by force. Second, as a sovereign nation, there cannot be limitations on Ukraine's armed forces that would leave the country vulnerable to future attack and thereby also undermining European security. Third, the centrality of the European Union in securing peace for Ukraine must be fully reflected. Ukraine must have the freedom and sovereign right to choose its own destiny. They have chosen a European destiny. It starts with the country's reconstruction, its integration into our single market and our defense industrial base, and ultimately joining our union.
Further details of what the Europeans put forward have now emerged, with the BBC reporting these counter-proposals to Trump's demands. So they say a cap on the Ukrainian armed forces at 800,000 personnel during peacetime, which to me seems completely implausible because they got 850,000 in war. So unless they only decommissioned 50,000 people, I don't see why you'd need an army that was 800,000 strong. And they also say Ukraine can join NATO, depending on consensus of NATO members, which says it does not exist. Again, they're not going to join NATO. NATO agrees to not permanently station troops in Ukraine. It goes on, the US to offer Ukraine a security guarantee similar to NATO's Article 5 in the face of Russian invasion. This means an attack on Ukraine would be treated as an attack against all in NATO. They say a security task force involving the US, Ukraine, Russia, and Europeans to enforce the agreement. And Ukraine commits to not recover occupied sovereign territory through military means, but through negotiations. The final point, very much reasonable, because Donald Trump was sort of saying that all this territory that Russia now has would become recognized as part of Russia, and that they would have to give up, Ukraine would have to give up some land that Russia didn't already control, which does seem unreasonable, humiliating. But this point of saying Ukraine will basically be allowed to join NATO, and even if it doesn't, it will have Article 5 rights, just seems implausible to me. Anyway, Donald Trump was at first not very happy with that intervention by the EU, posting this on Truth Social. Ukraine leadership has expressed zero gratitude for our efforts, and Europe continues to buy oil from Russia. The USA continues to sell massive amounts of weapons to NATO for distribution to Ukraine. Crooked Joe gave everything free, including big money. God bless all the lives that have been lost in the human catastrophe. While Trump was banging out catlock tweets, though, US, EU, and Ukrainian negotiators met in Geneva for talks. I mean, that's where things appear to have shifted somewhat. So on Sunday, US and Ukrainian delegations reported that they'd drawn up what they called an updated and refined peace framework during talks in Geneva, containing just 19 points rather than the initial 28. The new proposal is thought to take account of at least some European demands. It will also contain potentially some concessions advantageous to Russia, including Ukrainian elections, as soon as possible. So that was in the original 28 points. That's likely to remove Zelensky from power. It's also said to contain an invitation for Russia to rejoin the G8, ending years of increasing Russian international isolation. So the Europeans have agreed to that, which was in the 28-point original plan. According to reports, Zelensky and Trump may meet later this week. Commenting on the revised plan, a Russian spokesperson said it was, at the first glance, completely unconstructive and does not work for Russia. So that's the renewed deal. And the spokesperson was much more enthusiastic about the original unaltered US plan, saying, not all but many provisions of this plan seem quite acceptable to us. Now, again, that's the plan that they helped draft. So not particularly surprised. They were happy with it. Not everyone thinks the plan arrived at between the US and Russia was necessarily bad. So when it came out, lots of people saying this is everything Russia wanted. This is just Trump siding with Putin. And this is a complete outrage, never going to work. Obviously, the people who've always said Ukraine should hurry up and sign up for peace said, no, they're wrong. This is actually a good deal. Someone who was actually surprisingly in favor of this deal was Niall Ferguson. He's a neocon historian, very famous, one of the most sort of famous right-wing thought leaders in the world. He's been very pro-Ukraine, very anti-Russia, as I say, a neocon, essentially sort of saying we need to fight for the democracies against the autocracies. So his take on this took some by surprise. So he said this: the best is the enemy of the good. Contrary to recent press speculation, the draft 28-point plan for peace in Ukraine is in fact a reasonable basis for negotiations. Journalists can gripe about it as they griped about the 20-point Gaza plan, but wars are not ended by op-eds. Wars are ended either by victory or by compromise. The plan affirms Ukraine's sovereignty. It provides Ukraine with a US-backed security guarantee. It envisages Ukrainian reconstruction. Of course, the territorial terms and the amnesty for war crimes are hard to swallow. But if you want to take back territory and try Putin, you have to win the war. And realistically, Ukraine has never been in a position to defeat Russia. The critics should also acknowledge that President Trump has taken some risk here. I do not believe it is in the Ukrainian people's interest for the war to be prolonged for another year. The risks seem to be too great, so I hope Zelensky will use his eloquence to explain why the time is right to negotiate. Wars are ended either by victory or by compromise. This plan affirms Ukraine's sovereignty. It provides Ukraine with a US-backed security guarantee. It envisages Ukrainian reconstruction. Of course, the territorial terms and the amnesty for war crimes are hard to swallow. I don't usually say this, but in this case, I agree with Niall Ferguson. Zack Polanski is riding high in the polls, and the Greens have now breached 175,000 members. But the harder task for Polanski will be persuading skeptics of his ideas for the country. And to that end, he laid out his argument for a wealth tax this weekend on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg.
If you go back, say, 1 million minutes, you get back to the beginning of 2023. Most people can probably remember what they were doing at the beginning of 2023. If you go back 1 billion minutes, you get to the Roman Empire. That's the difference in inequality in this country. So I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires paying their fair share. Now, it's important to say, people will say, does that raise enough? Is it just about raising revenue? That's not actually the point. Of course, the money is important. Well, the real point is about tackling inequality.
So you've got, a good analogy about how big a billion is. Obviously, it's difficult to sort of imagine these numbers. Having £1 billion is unnecessary for anyone. We should be taxing people with £1 billion. Zack Polanski there also, I suppose, trying to preempt the argument that's been made against wealth taxes, which is that the ones that have been proposed won't raise that much money. So sort of the estimations sort of vary between sort of around 10 billion and 25 billion, which is between 1% and 2% of government spending. So you can't say, there are no spending constraints on the government because we can just tax wealth, because none of the wealth taxes proposed, radically change the position of the government. That doesn't mean we should do them. We should do them. But he's saying we should do it to tackle inequality, not necessarily because it will raise lots of money. Now, let's look at how Laura Kuenssberg followed that up.
The point then for you of putting up tax on the very wealthy is to try to stop them being as wealthy. It's not actually to raise money for schools and hospitals and public services.
We can raise that money anyway. What it's about is the fact that if you have that much money, if you're a billionaire, you can't spend it quickly, even if you try. So you hoard it in assets. And it's the assets that are the problem here, because that's exacerbating the inequality that already exists. But what we need to do is get that money and those assets flowing around the economy.
But how do you raise that money anyway if it's not through taxation?
Well, there's a few ways. So Sharon was exactly right earlier when she's talking about borrowing to invest. That's one way. Mm-hmm. But also there's something called spending multipliers, which is where you invest in the economy, say the National Health Service. You get that money back because you have a well population. Now, of course, it's important that people are healthy just to be healthy. But actually, if you cut through austerity, that's a completely false economy. You have people missing work, you have more long-term health conditions, and you break the economy in the way that we've seen both Conservative governments do it and Labour government now too.
But you say there you can borrow. The government's already borrowing enormous amounts, and there is an already massive amount of national debt. And it's way more than the government spends every year, and it costs a fortune to pay the interest on that debt. So would you not put any limits on government borrowing?
Well, the first thing to say is debt to GDP ratio is at 100%. In Japan, it's 270%, and they have much better living standards than we do.
But in terms of this country, it's at the highest level it's been for a very, very long time. the financial markets are very sensitive to the decisions that the Chancellor makes. That's the case whether you'd like it or not. The UK's already got huge levels of debt. So are you suggesting that actually you'd be relaxed about the government borrowing much, much more?
Well, I think Andy Burnham was really interesting recently when he said we need to stop being in hock to the bond markets. And I think
And there was a market reaction.
Well, exactly. So what I think we need to do is get back to a place where actually democratic politicians who are elected by the people are more worried about the cleaners, the teachers, the nurses, the people on the ground who are actually creating the economy with their hands, rather than the people who hold these assets, who are making money while they sleep without actually working. That's deeply problematic. Now, are the markets important? Of course, they play a role, but much more important is the trust of the public on the politicians that they democratically elect. And we've gone so far the other way.
So those statements about not having to worry too much about borrowing, especially when it comes to spending on the NHS, got a lot of negative attention online. So the former head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who probably sort of the most mainstream economics think tank in the country, said, very worrying coming from the leader of an increasingly popular party. The populism of far left and far right have much in common, pretending there are simple answers, no economic constraints, and always others to blame and others who will pay. David Gauke, who was a Treasury Minister during the austerity years, so not a great economic record himself, he said this: Zack Polanski's economic approach is extraordinarily ignorant and dangerous. The economist on Laura Kuenssberg's panel, was also critical. Andy Haldane is the former chief economist at the Bank of England.
When you hear Zack Polanski say, basically, we can borrow almost as much as we want in a different way, the markets have got too much power, we shouldn't be in hock to them, as Andy Burnham suggests, is that, because it might sound appealing to lots of people, their polling suggests it's really appealing to lots of people. How does it sound to your ears?
It's la-la land economics. Let's be
La-la land.
I'm a man at the Bank of England. I presided over almost £1 trillion of money printing. If that was the route to success and growth, would have long since solved this problem. This is not the time for funny money solutions. We need to invest, and that is the only route, I think, to getting back to growth.
But you do think, Andy, that we should change our fiscal rules and loosen them, don't you? So, of course, that's what we're talking about, that actually the fiscal rules can be loosened to borrow, to invest.
So the £1 trillion that he was involved in printing, that was quantitative easing after the 2008 financial crisis, and then the money that was printed during the COVID pandemic. And Andy Haldane saying, I've done money printing. It's one, it didn't rescue the economy, and also it's not going to work very well now. Now's not the time for funny money. Andy Haldane then was representing the dominant view in economics, the mainstream view in economics. Not everyone agrees, though. Daniela Gabor is Professor of Economics at SOAS and recently debated Andy Haldane in a podcast for the London Review of Books. So I wanted to ask her what she felt about that. So the Andy Haldane and Zack Polanski trading blows there.
Hi, everybody. Well, I was quite, in some ways, amused and surprised by the reaction that Andy Haldane gave to this, because I think in some ways it dismissed a relatively complex economic argument that Zack Polanski was making under kind of unfriendly fire from Laura Kuenssberg about how we should think about borrowing, how we should think about the government spending, and he dismissed it as in, this is la-la land economics. What we need to do now is, the British government has to demonstrate to the public and to the bond markets that it can rein in spending. And I think it sort of, and this interpretation that Haldane had is not just his, it's pretty pervasive in certain areas of the British commentariat and the punditry. It dismisses the progressive narrative that Zack Polanski is trying to shape, and he's a kind of lonely voice there, is dismissing it as this guy wants to borrow indefinitely, he wants free lunches, he doesn't understand how economics works, and don't take him seriously. And if your viewers have seen the clip already, I think he's given quite a careful answer where what he's trying to do is to say, we in Britain have, even since the 2008 global financial crisis, we have lived with this political narrative of a dichotomy between the bond markets and the government. George Osborne had this dichotomy. Keir Starmer has this dichotomy. Andy Haldane in some ways operates with this dichotomy that says The government has to make sure that it doesn't displease the bond markets, that its bond markets are some kind of vigilantes. There is a whole term coined during the Clinton administration, the bond vigilantes, these financiers that sit there, they look at the spending plans of a government, they look at the tax plans of a government, and they either give a seal of approval or they don't. And government should be really, really stressed about this. And what Polanski did is to say this dichotomy actually is not how the relationship or macroeconomics works in the UK. There is a third factor, which is the Bank of England. This Bank of England is very important because it has bought government bonds on a massive scale, very aggressively during what we call the period of quantitative easing, is now selling and has been selling for a while government bonds at a very aggressive scale. It's the most aggressive central bank in the world, and it's creating very significant fiscal costs for the government. So Polanski, in some ways, has a much more, they dismiss him as an kind of ignoramus that doesn't understand and lives in la-la land economics, but he has, in some ways, a more sophisticated understanding. Okay, you can't go in an interview on the BBC and start to explain the mechanics of the relationship between the central bank and the government, but he's trying his best to say it's not so simple. And even if it was this simple, when you talk about bond market investors, the story is far more complicated. And maybe we can come back to this, because I usually tell people to read Tobin Angle, who used to be a bond market, a gilt market investor, and he says the best compliment that the bond market can pay to a government's spending plans is a mild sell-off. So seeing prices increasing is a compliment that says the market thinks the growth plan is going to work.
Let's. I want to park the Bank of England and bond markets just for one moment, because that's what we'll spend most of the interview discussing. But I suppose the thing that I thought Andy Haldane might have been referring to when he said funny money, and why this one of the reasons this caused controversy, is not just something that divides the right from the left or the centre from the left, but also a big debate within the left, because there are people sort of on the MMT wing, so Richard Murphy and people like that, who sort of say taxes don't finance spending. There isn't really that much of like maybe there's a limit when it comes to inflation, but we shouldn't get too hung up whatsoever about the idea that you need to raise taxes to increase spending. And then there are people like Gary Stevenson who say, look, this sort of monetary policy of printing money, it hasn't worked in the past. It's not going to work again. The only way that we're going to deal with the problem this country has is by taxing the rich to improve the fiscal situation of the government. And I suppose I wonder where you come in there. And I suppose for me, what I was a bit confused by is this idea that spending on the NHS will pay for itself because it will make the population more healthy. Like, I'm obviously in favour of spending more on the NHS, but I feel like you're probably going to have to tax people more to spend more on the NHS because that's current spending. I don't know, where do you stand on that?
Okay, thank you. You're cutting to the heart of the problem. I would say that relying on or invoking MMT, modern money theory, in the current political context is not a very wise political strategy, and I discourage anybody from trying to do so. I think we have to be very clear that MMT is first a description of the mechanics of the relationship between the central bank and the government, and the moment in which, and it says basically, if the government has an account at the central bank, when it spends, it basically injects more money in the economy. And when it taxes, it sucks out money from the economy. Now, there are many added complications to this, because the government might not have an account at the central bank, or it might be restricted in the way that it uses, as it is in the UK, with this account at the central bank. So to me, it's not very useful a framing to now go and say, if with this institutional arrangement, then we don't need to think about taxes. I think we have to think about taxation. And I think not only to think about taxation as a question of, are we able to raise revenue for the kinds of things that we need to spend on, but are we able to use taxation as a tool for inequality, to manage inequalities in the British economy? And to me, what Zack Polanski has done is to say, well, I would like to focus more on the second, on taxation as a kind of redistributive tool rather than a fiscal spend instrument. I am not I'm not very concerned about, we say, all you need to do is spend and everything will be great. That's not the institutional arrangement that we have in the UK. So having said that, the second part, the idea that monetary policy or printing money is either inherently inflationary because it creates asset price inflation, or it goes into the pockets of the rich one way or another. I think also that's a view that requires nuance, in the sense of, if you look at the Bank of England printing money, or funny money, I don't want to call it funny money, and I'm surprised that Andy Haldane calls it funny money, because he was at the Bank of England when the bank was printing this funny money. But most of what the Bank of England has done is to buy large quantities of government bonds, of gilts, both after the global financial crisis and during the COVID pandemic. At some point, at the height of the COVID pandemic, the Bank of England was holding up to 50% of the overall stock of government bonds issued by the British government. Now, the question is not, should the central bank buy these government bonds, make life easier or not in terms of what is the interest rate at which government spends? The question always is, what is the government spending on? And is it spending on some kind of overall strategy that can generate productivity improvement, that can generate, I would say, economic growth of some sort, and that can generate economic competitiveness. So to me, the question is always not just how do we finance, but what is it for? As for, and I'm going to stop here, as for the question of if we spend more on the NHS, will that create more fiscal space? I'm not sure he said exactly that, but now trying to unpick what a guy said during a 3-minute interview is complicated. The way that I understood it, and the way that I would like to understand it, is to say, we have in Britain a problem of long-term illness that keeps people out of the labor market. That problem of long-term illness is to some extent due to the shortages of capacity in the NHS to deal with long-term illness. And I know this because I am a long-term ill person. I have long COVID, and I'm only able to manage the workload because I'm in academia, and I can work throughout the day. But if I had to be standing on my feet from 9 to 5 every day, I would be unemployed. And the NHS does not offer support for people like me. This I know very well because I've tried very hard to get it. So what Zack Polanski is saying, to me, the way that I want to read him is to say, if we get people like Daniela and people who would like to work, who are desperate to work because they don't want to be sitting at home on very low, if I was unemployed, the unemployment benefits are very low. If we want to get people like Daniela back into the labor market, we need to fund public services that allow her to go there. But Daniela and people like Daniela getting into the labor market would mean increasing productivity, increasing tax revenues, increasing economic activity. In my case, hopefully better educated students because I'm in a university job. That's all he's saying. He's saying it pays for itself in the sense that I don't need to get unemployment benefits, and I'm contributing to the overall level of economic activity in a country.
Let's move away from the exact wording of what Zack Polanski sort of said in any formulation of any one sentence. And I actually want to move to what Andy Haldane said, because I suppose to steel man his case, he wasn't saying funny money is always wrong. He said he specifically said, like, I'm the guy at the Bank of England I was the guy at the Bank of England when they printed one trillion pounds. So he says, I'm all in, I recognize that sometimes very expansionary monetary policy is necessary. But he's saying now is not the time for funny money. And he's saying now is not the time for funny money because, he didn't really expand, but I would assume he would expand and say because inflation is already quite high, it's not obvious that there is lots of spare capacity in the economy. Interest rates are already quite high. So basically he was saying now is not the time for really expansionary monetary policy, which is not necessarily an unreasonable point, is it?
So it's not... The way that I understand the point about funny money is should a Zack Polanski-led government borrow in order to, and he said very clearly, should he borrow to invest in capital infrastructure investment? And let's remember that 6 months ago, this was the mantra of the Keir Starmer government. They were going to generate massive amounts of public investment because we live in a world where everybody is doing industrial policy, everybody's trying to be more competitive. The British economy cannot fall behind. So I'm not quite sure that this was an argument about expansionary monetary policy, as it was an an argument about the ways in which a government can transform an economy in an age where everybody is using government tools, from Donald Trump to China to Europe. Everybody is using the government fiscal policy, industrial policy to steer the economy aggressively in one direction or other. And in the case of Britain, we cannot do this, and the Labour government is not doing this on any significant scale. You could say because they don't have a vision and they are centrists, and their idea is, we just let the markets kind of work with a little bit of help from us. But you can also think, okay, they are not doing this because they are afraid of the bond markets. And when you're afraid of the bond markets, you just think in terms of, what will the bond market allow me to do? What it will not allow me to do? And I'm not convinced that this argument is correct, because we know that bond markets actually like economies that are in a slow growth or in a slump, because that's when they get more profits. You make profits if the prices of gilts increase when in a low growth scenario. And bond market investors themselves say, and I don't know if I'm repeating myself, that the best compliment that the bond markets can pay to a chancellor is a mild sell-off. So I don't know that Andy Haldane was making an overall judgment about whether we are at full employment, whether there is nothing to be done and we are in a rosy economic situation. I think that's not the case. I think there are very serious long-term problems of the British economy, and the idea that we can't do anything because the bond markets don't let us, I think it's a political dead end. And my worry is that it takes us into the hands of Reform, who is very happy to say, we are in a completely wrong place, we have to change things, and we will change them. And this is exactly what people want to hear, and that's exactly what Zack Polanski is also saying.
This has been a strange weekend for the Democratic Socialists of America. First, Zohran Mamdani, a member of the organization, now, of course, the Democratic Socialist mayor of New York, was praised to high heaven by Donald Trump in the White House. And then, this was even stranger, their unofficial house journal, so Jacobin magazine, we get Bhaskar Sankara, their founder, on the show all the time. An article from Jacobin was shared by Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll start with the Mamdani-Trump summit.
Just days ago, you referred to President Trump as a despot who had betrayed the country. You said you'd be his worst nightmare and accused him of having a fascist agenda. Are you planning to retract any of these remarks in order to improve your relationship?
I think both President Trump and I, we are very clear about our positions and our views. And what I really appreciate about the president is that the meeting that we had focused not on places of disagreement, which there are many, and also focused on the shared purpose that we have in serving New Yorkers. And frankly, that is something that could transform the lives of the 8.5 million people who are currently struggling under a cost of living crisis, with 1 in 4 living in poverty. And the meeting came back again and again to what it could look like to lift those New Yorkers out of struggle and start to deliver them a city that they could do more than just struggle to afford it, but actually start to live in it.
And I've been called much worse than a despot, so it's not that insulting. Maybe I think he'll change his mind after we get to working together.
So, I mean, very, very accommodating. Obviously Mamdani being incredibly smooth as he always is, and Donald Trump saying, I've been called worse. Who cares? Yeah, he called me a despot, whatever. These things happen. Trump then got even more accommodating when another reporter tried the same tack.
Are you affirming that you think President Trump is a fascist?
I've spoken about...
That's okay. You can just say yes. Okay. It's easier. It's easier than explaining it. I don't mind.
It's easier. Just call me a fascist. Go on. Then we can move on to something else. Completely bizarre. Well, is it bizarre? I mean, I saw some people commenting on Twitter that on the one hand, Trump just likes strong characters, and Mamdani is a very strong character. The other is to say, maybe did he always think that politics was a bit of a game? And one of the reasons he got so angry at the people saying stop Trump is he was like, this is all just a game. Why are they taking it so seriously? And Mamdani clearly did something in their private conversation, which meant that Trump felt like this is a guy I can do business with. Someone online put out, obviously I think it's actually worth watching the whole press conference between them. But obviously we're not going to show you a 20-minute press conference, so we're going to show you a supercut of Trump and Mamdani's interaction from, I think, someone on Twitter.
We had some interesting conversation, and some of his ideas really are the same ideas that I have. And he said some things that were very interesting as to housing construction. And he wants to see houses go up. He wants to see a lot of houses created, a lot of apartments built, etc. And, you know, we actually, people would be shocked. But I want to see the same thing.
In the speech, you didn't mention anything about America.
I expect to be helping him, not hurting him. A big help, because I want New York City to be great. I think this mayor can do some things that are going to be really great.
Would you feel comfortable living in New York City under a Mamdani administration?
Yeah, I would. I really would. Especially after the meeting. Absolutely. We agree on a lot more than I would have thought. I want him to do a great job, and we'll help him do a great job.
Sorry, I said someone on Twitter put it together. It was by Rebecca K. Katz. Thank you for putting together that supercar. I don't want to be dismissive of her work. Ash, were you surprised the extent to which they just got on like a house on fire? Like Donald Trump loves Mamdani.
How could I be surprised? And how could you be surprised, Michael, when you know full well that people will do anything for a South Asian leftist with a great smile and just a hint of a dimple? Just a hint. I mean, look, in all seriousness, of course it was surprising. Of course it was surprising. When you think about the way in which Mamdani has been presented as a communist jihadist, when you think about the many, many statements that he's made on the record, you know, his utter contempt for everything that Trump stands for, the aggressiveness of Republican messaging, and I think even Donald Trump's messaging during the mayoral campaign itself, I think that there had been some bated breath for this meeting. And it must be said that the stakes for Mamdani were really, really high. So in order for Mamdani to carry out his proposed program, you know, he would need a president that wouldn't sign an executive order immediately defunding New York, or, you know, an executive order sending in the National Guard and things of that nature. The stakes were incredibly high. But here's what I think in retrospect makes their interactions make sense. The first thing is that Donald Trump very much sees himself as a New Yorker, sees himself as someone who wants to make New York great again. There's a certain level of boosterism that he's had about that. Now, of course, you can think about the way in which he's done that, the property deals and the lawsuits and the unpaid invoices, but he's someone who is at least sincere in his self-image as someone who really, really loves New York. And I think that's something which Mamdani, throughout his mayoral campaign, has been able to speak to as well. This love for what New York is, this desire to make New York affordable. Second thing is that while Mamdani's identity and his ability to speak to a vision of New York that was sort of textured and lived in and diverse was really important to his campaign, identity politics really wasn't. And in fact, you can see lots of ways in which Mamdani has moved away from a more, you know, traditionally id-pol framing of certain things, particularly in this campaign. And so I think that that's an area not of common ground, but it means that it takes something out of the field, which could have been very provoking to Donald Trump. There's a third thing, which is I think Donald Trump is someone who likes you know, celebrity and the popularity of others. He likes strength and success in others. He despises weakness. And then there's one last thing. The thing which I've heard about Zohran Mamdani from absolutely everyone who's interacted with him, including a friend of mine who has spent a long time working with him, is that he has an ability to make people feel really good about themselves when he talks to them. Now, of course, that's important for things like door knocking and canvassing and rallying the troops. But it's also really important when you've got someone like Trump who is so fickle, so volatile, so moved by flattery, and you know, so provoked by, you know, what he sees as sort of contempt or you know, a display of domineering behavior and things of that nature. So I think that unequivocally this was a really successful meeting. Now, there are huge caveats. One is because Trump is fickle, because he's volatile, because he's got a habit of taking things so personally, because he's so moved by flattery and so, you know, driven to extremes by what he perceives as contempt, is that the the good outcomes of that meeting, which were more about, Trump saying, look, I want to help you and, I don't want to send in the National Guard, stuff of this nature. Those things are precarious. Those things are at the mercy of Trump's whims. So what is it that Zohran Mamdani and his team plan to do to sort of take care of that relationship going forward? Don't know, but that's going to be something that's really important. And the other thing is thinking, how will Trump react to what is absolutely going to be an all-out press war from Fox News and the sort of highlighting of particular stories to try and, make New York City look like a violent, crime-infested hellhole, in a way which sort of beats the drums for more draconian and authoritarian forms of intervention. So none of this can be taken as a cast iron promise for the future, but it was definitely surprising. It also makes a certain amount of sense in retrospect.
Let's go on to the Jacobin-Netanyahu link-up, which I think is the even stranger thing that happened on Friday, because it's the Israeli Prime Minister posting this online. So it's without comment. He shared an article from the left-wing magazine discussing a claim from Jeffrey Epstein's emails that the billionaire meddled in Israel's 2019 elections. That was when former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who the files show was a very close friend of Epstein's, tried to challenge Netanyahu's grip on power. He failed. Now, perhaps Netanyahu was so keen to sort of make an enemy look bad, Ehud Barak, that he didn't notice that he was platforming a magazine that has rightly accused him of genocide and war crimes many, many times. It's also interesting that the Israeli Prime Minister is willing to talk about, or at least share articles about, the Israel-Epstein connection, which even the New York Times won't touch. So this is how that Jacobin article ended, which Netanyahu shared without comment to his millions of followers on Twitter. They write, even with the wealth of material that's been released, Epstein's exact relationship to Israel remains unclear, not to mention an answer to the specific question of whether or not he belonged to Israeli intelligence. While the latest disclosures show Epstein had a keen interest in Israel and its politics, they also show he held a similar interest in many countries and regions and had relationships with a variety of power players across the Middle East and around the world. But what they should mean, at minimum, is an end to the widespread taboo of even asking questions about the billionaire sex offenders' links to the Israeli state. Epstein brokered security deals for Israel, had a close relationship with one of its former prime ministers and military officials, and apparently, even secretly, involved himself in the country's elections. If it were any other country, it would not be remotely scandalous to wonder out loud what it could all mean. So that's the Jacobin piece, very explicitly saying the reason this isn't being talked about is because there's a taboo about talking about Israeli political influence, right? And as sort of the article points out before, sort of like New York Times and other liberal magazines aren't willing to touch this because they're worried they'll get accused of being anti-Semitic. And now Netanyahu has just shared it on his Twitter. Other Israeli politicians noticed how Netanyahu jumping on this story could be to Israel's disadvantage. So former Prime Minister and Netanyahu threat Naftali Bennett accused him of legitimizing the anti-Semitic and anti-Israel Jacobin and called the tweet a complete loss of national judgment. Before I go to Ash, I should say we did what I think actually was a brilliant interview on this, not because not from my side, but from the person I was speaking to, who was Murtaza Hussain from Dropsite, who really just made me understand the Israel-Epstein connections in a much more concrete way than I had done before, answered many of sort of the questions I've had for a very long time. So do check that out, that interview with Murtaza Hussain from last week. Ash, though, what I want to know from you is, did you ever imagine seeing Benjamin Netanyahu sharing without comment an article from Jacobin?
No. I mean, that really was not on my 2025 bingo card. What was on my 2025 bingo card was Luigi Mangione surprise Glasto set and also swim caps gonna be big. So yeah, I don't think I'm winning in the prediction race at the moment. One of the things which I find so entertaining about this particular story is that the tactic of, anything that politically I don't like is going to be called anti-Semitic, can even apply to Benjamin Netanyahu. So we've come to expect it when it's time to disparage or smear Palestine solidarity. We've come to expect it when it comes to, policy decisions which are obstructive to Israeli interests in some way. But the fact that it can be, Israeli politician on Israeli politician violence, and that one of those politicians is Benjamin Netanyahu, is just. I mean, I really, really can't wait for the inevitable, Benjamin Netanyahu as Hamas. Like, that is going to be an attack line coming from his colleagues in the Knesset at some point.
You forget you're allowed to do, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory as long as you're also very pro-Israel. That's the rules. And who could be more pro-Israel than Benjamin Netanyahu? Ash, let's wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
It was so good to be reunited. Let's not leave it so long next time.
No, I haven't looked at the schedule. You better be on next Monday. Are you on next Monday? You are?
I am not.
Oh,
I am.
I'm looking forward to it already. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.